Okay, hello. Welcome back. I want to make sure that you do something that I suggested you do at the first class when we were remote, but now that we're together, I can emphasize it. And that is, one of the best ways of learning is to talk to people who disagree with you. And I know that since we were at Berkeley, it may be a little bit hard to find people who disagree with you. But please do, seek them out. And when you do, just listen and keep your minds and ears and sometimes your hearts open, because that's where you have to re-examine your beliefs, and you have to make sure that somebody else doesn't have something to contribute that might even convince you that you were wrong. In other words, an openness to alternative views is extremely important in terms of your education. Now, today, before we get going, I want to just review where we were, because last week we did a lot of complicated things, and it was hard for me, and if it's hard for me, it's obviously going to be hard for you. If we prevented all the hidden upward pre-distributions, maybe we would worry less about redistribution. Now, I didn't say that directly to you last week, but that was one of the underlying themes. Because you remember 2 weeks ago, we talked about market and government being inextricably related to one another. Well, if you understood and followed the logic, there are a lot of pre-distributions that occur inside the market that are political, because the market's rules are determined by people, by public officials. And the question that we examined a few weeks ago is, who has the most influence over those public officials? Well, you get a lot of pre-distribution. If we didn't have to worry about the results of the pre-distribution, if we prevented all the hidden upward pre-distributions, and we looked at a lot of those, then maybe we wouldn't have to worry quite as much about redistribution. Both taxing and spending can be regressive or progressive. And you should know the meaning of those two terms and understand what I mean by spending could be progressive or regressive. And then note the difference between marginal and effective tax rates. We went through a lot of this last week. We don't have to repeat it right now. And then consider all taxes. When you're talking about the regressivity or the progressivity of a tax system, make sure you look at every tax, not just the income tax, because there are a lot of other taxes, like the payroll tax, that are extremely important and are growing in importance. Oh, and tax expenditures. We didn't really have a chance to get into tax expenditures. My favorite topic, apart from the stepped-up basis at death rule. You remember that? I expect you to just share my excitement about the stepped-up basis at death rule. Well, the tax expenditures are another area that it's sort of exciting because people don't know about it, and it's huge, and maybe if they knew about it, and maybe if they were a little bit disturbed about it, maybe that would all change, and there is a possibility, huge possibilities for change. Remember, we ended with this comparison, Berkeley and Stanford, and I didn't really have a chance to get into it with you because the hour ended. But the reason we were talking about that, and it may have been kind of out, you may have said, what? This is random. Why are we talking about Berkeley and Stanford? Because we were talking about tax expenditures. And one tax expenditure is the charitable deduction. What is the charitable deduction? You can deduct from your income taxes money that you spend on charity. Well, what's a charity? Does that mean only for poor people? Or does it mean any organization that's a not-for-profit? Or what exactly does it mean? Is Berkeley or Stanford a charity? Yes. There's a lot of indirect government help that goes to both of these places. Berkeley has $350 million a year in direct subsidy from the state of California. Well, that's obvious because it's a public university, and that's what public universities get, is state subsidies. There are 31,000 undergraduates. We know that. So the direct subsidy per undergraduate is about $11,290, and about 30% of our students here are Pell Grant eligible. That means their families have relatively low incomes, low enough to be eligible for the Pell Grant program, which goes to students whose families are, again, relatively low income. Well, let's take a look at Stanford. $500 million a year, more than Berkeley, in philanthropy, charitable donations. Those charitable donations are deductible. They are deducted from the taxes of the people who make them. So the tax subsidy to Stanford is about $200 million more per year than the tax subsidy to Berkeley. This is, again, tax expenditure is the same thing as government spending. It's as if the federal government was saying to Stanford, here is $200 million more per year than Berkeley is getting. You all follow that? There are 7,100 undergraduates, so the tax subsidy, the charitable deduction tax subsidy, is $28,000 more per undergraduate at Stanford. And there are only 15% of the undergraduates are Pell Grant eligible. I just thought you might like this comparison. I mean, we're talking about inequality, and this is an example, everyday example, of a big, big government subsidy going to a place that is not providing nearly the help or education to poor families. Just one example, just one example. So today's outlet, the other thing about this course that you already recognize, but I thought I'd just make it explicit, is that we are dealing with issues that are all around us every day. This is a course in not only what's happening, but also understanding the context of what's happening. So we're going to be talking today about, guess what? Inflation. And those of you who looked at the consumer price index number that came out yesterday know that inflation is running about 7.9% on an annualized basis, which means that your dollars are, in terms of purchasing power, are shrinking. Everything is becoming more expensive at a rate of 7.9% a year. Haven't seen that degree of inflation since 1982, by some measures 1981. Particularly in big expenditures, housing, energy, food. The typical American family is spending 63% of their budget on those three. And they're going up faster than incomes are going up, which means people are getting poorer. We're going to be talking about that. We're also going to be, next week, the Federal Reserve Board is meeting to decide whether to raise interest rates. What does that mean? It means a lot. We're going to be talking about that today as well, putting it all into context. Inflation and recession. We're going to look at the business cycle, then we're going to be looking at fiscal policy. You don't have to know what this is yet. In fact, if you already know everything about it, well, you think you do. You don't. Then we're going to be looking at monetary policy, and then we're going to be looking at why tight labor markets are good for people at the bottom. You don't even know yet exactly what a tight labor market is, I hope. And then we'll look at the big switcheroo, which you certainly don't know what that I'm talking about. Your grasp of macroeconomics is A, quite good, B, fair, C, poor, D, awful. What is macroeconomics? Go. And let's see if we can get you, this is not a complicated analytic question. I mean, there's no right answer. Again, nobody's going to know. This is confidential. Only the CIA has any record of what you have decided today. Okay, let's see what you think. All right. So most of you have you've taken a course. You've been exposed to it. You have not taken a course, and about 24% of you poor, you would say. But about 28% of you've taken a course in it, and you think you understand it. But let me just say, even to those 28%, we're going to approach macroeconomics from an angle, from a lens that we don't approach it from here in Berkeley in macroeconomics classes. We're going to be looking at the distributional consequences of macroeconomics. Very important. And every time today, just like the tax discussion we had last week, every time you start feeling, well, this is pretty abstract, I want you to remind yourself, even if I don't remind you, we're talking about consequences for real people, families, real world, tangible consequences in terms of their lives and what they can afford. So what I want to start with is inflation and recession. And we call it the business cycle. We call it the business cycle because basically there is a cycle of the economy doing wonderfully well and then doing a little bit too well and going into inflation and then falling into recession. Now, before we get into this too deeply, I want to warn you that the business cycle is not just an automatic thing. We have just been through a pandemic business cycle. By a pandemic business cycle, I mean that the normal laws of the business cycle that we're going to go through right now were still applicable and are still applicable, but the major variable had to do with a pandemic. And I'll get to that. I'll explain this. Just bear this in mind. So here is the business cycle. There, over here on the left is the economy. You have expansions, and then you have contractions. And, it goes up and down and up and down. And what's the main reason for the ups and downs of the business cycle? Now, pandemic, no, we're not going to talk about that right yet. What's the main reason normally for the ups and downs? Businesses become too optimistic during upturns and create too much capacity and then have to reverse course. Or B, consumers spend too much during upturns until they're so deep in debt, they have to reverse course. Or is it C, government spends too much in good times and then must pull way back as budget deficits mount. Or D, oh, here's the pandemic. Pandemics come along and disrupt the economy. What's the major, usual reason for the business cycle? Go. It's a little bit of A, it's a little bit of B, it's a little bit of C, and now it's D. In other words, this is a trick question. It's sort of all of these, but let me explain why it's all of these. So the way you envision this is you have the productive capacity of a nation. How much can a nation produce? How much can the United States produce? And its people, how much can they produce? How productive are they? Offices, factories, laboratories, infrastructure, technology, equipment, all of the things that are productive, that is the productive capacity of a nation at any individual time. Demand for goods and services, including public goods, such as, we might say, education or the environment. And that is symbolized by our little hand here: consumers, government, exports, and business. These are all demands. This is demand on the capacity of the economy to produce. And then you have, when more demand than capacity, prices rise. Now, this should be intuitively obvious to you, because if you've got just a certain number of things, and you and your, let's just take the example of you and your friends, all want, and they're scarce, you might bid up the price. No, I want that, I want that. But you see, when you have a scarcity, prices go up because prices are bid up. So consumers, government, exports, and business all are bidding up the price of the productive capacity. When demand exceeds supply. Now, when you have less demand than capacity, that is more supply than demand, you get the opposite effect. You get basically not only prices maybe stop growing, but also people stop having jobs. There's a lot of excess capacity. There's a lot of office space that goes unused, underutilized, or space in factories. Things start closing, retail businesses. Now, why this is interesting now is that the pandemic that we all went through, and are still to some extent going through, that pandemic started, you remember, it seems like ancient history, in February of 2020, and what happened? The economy went into a recession because demand suddenly dropped. You still had a lot of supply. I mean, you still had factories, you still had retail establishments, you still had hotels and businesses and restaurants, but nobody wanted to buy, nobody wanted to go. Everybody got very scared. When people get scared, they stop buying, and so you had a recession. Demand dropped, but all that capacity was still there. What does that mean? A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of retail businesses went out of business. A lot of restaurants and hotels had to close. A lot of factories went idle. That was a recession. Demand dropped, but the supply was still there. Initially, the supply is still there. But then what happened 2 years later? Well, 2 years later, the opposite happens. You've got demand coming back because there's a lot of pent-up demand. People have not bought a lot of stuff that they would like to buy. In fact, they still can't feel comfortable necessarily going into movies or taking a lot of plane trips, but they have a little bit of money. They've saved up. They haven't spent very much. And so there's a lot of demand, but you don't yet have the supply cranked up because the supply shrank during the pandemic. And so what happens when you've got a lot of demand and you have inadequate supply to meet that demand? Inflation. Hello, this is not rocket science. The inflation we are now seeing is, to some extent, the other side of the same coin of the recession we went into in 2020. Now, why does this intersect with this class? Because when you go into a recession, when people lose their jobs, the first people to lose their jobs tend to be in the bottom half of the income distribution. Those people with relatively low skills, those people who are thought of by employers as being fairly fungible, they are out of work first. And now you would think that they would be the first ones to be rehired. No, they are among the last to be rehired. First fired, last rehired, but they also are casualties of some government policies that we will examine today. Recessions cause unemployment, especially among the bottom half. And here we can see, starting in 1950, okay, so what you can see here, starting in 1950, extending to 2020, you can see here, these vertical lines are recessions. And you can see with every recession, what happens, you've got people losing their jobs. Here in 2020, look what happened. Boom. And the unemployment by race, because there are a disproportionate number of people of color who are in the bottom half or the bottom two-thirds, you can see that unemployment takes a big toll, business cycle, in terms of recessions on Black and Hispanic people. It takes a toll on everybody, but disproportionately on Black and Hispanic people. In February to May 2020, we saw this in a big way, because you can see that between February and May 2020, we all lived through it. White men, certainly, their unemployment increased dramatically, but look what happened to white women. Well, their unemployment level increased even more dramatically. If you were a Black man or a Black woman or a Hispanic man or Hispanic woman, your jobs, you lost your job, the chance that you lost your job, much greater. Is this because of systemic racism? Well, maybe a piece of it, but it depends how you define systemic racism. A lot of it is just because, or I shouldn't say just because, a lot of it is because a disproportionate number of people who are poor are Black and Hispanic. And that itself is probably the result of systemic racism. We will be talking about that, by the way, next week. Which gets us to fiscal policy. Fiscal policy. You hear that word all the time. Fiscal policy. When I was in the Clinton administration, we got there. Bill Clinton wanted to do a lot of investing. He wanted to do a lot of investing in education and basic research. And I had written a book called The Work of Nations, and he actually, he had read it. I mean, I was so, well, he's an old friend, and I pushed it into his hands, so he had no choice. But when he got to be president, he asked me to be head of his economic transition team. I didn't know what an economic transition team was. I was teaching at the time. In fact, I didn't even know, I knew that he was running for president, obviously, and I knew that he was elected, but I was teaching the day when he, the day after the election, and I was in the middle of a very intense discussion with students, and somebody came into the classroom, and I said, I'm sorry, I am teaching, and the person said, well, the president is on the phone. And I said, well, I'm teaching. And the person said, well, it's the president-elect. Oh, I said, well, that's a big difference. And I said to the class, do you mind if I just talk to the president-elect? And everybody said, oh, great. Oh, no. So I went and I said, excuse me, and I went and I said, Bill, because I knew him as Bill. And I said, Bill, you were just elected president. And he said, yeah. Boy, did I feel dumb. Well, I didn't know, you don't know what to say at times like that. And he said, Bob, and you have to imagine a southern, Arkansas accent. Bob, I want you to come down and run my economic transition team. And I said, but Bill, I'm teaching. He said, Bob, I really need you. Well, I went back to the class and I said, I know we're in the middle of the semester, and I said this to another class I was teaching as well. I said, I apologize. The new president, the president-elect, just asked me to come down to Arkansas to run his economic transition team, and then people started asking me, well, what is an economic transition team? And I said, I have no idea. But everybody, I got quote-unquote permission from the students and dean, and everybody was very excited. I went down to Arkansas, Little Rock, and I went to the governor's mansion, and I said, I'm here. And he said, well, can you kind of figure out what I should do about the economy? Well, that didn't give me much guidance. And so I kind of rounded up the people who had been his economic advisors, besides me, during the campaign. And we had a meeting on the phone. We didn't have Zoom, but we had a phone meeting. I said, well, he would like to know what we have to do. He's going to be president, actually take the reins. He's going into the Oval Office. He will be inaugurated in January. And he's going to have an economic policy. And then I divided the team up into different groups. One group would be fiscal policy, another group would be monetary policy, another group would be investment, public investment. So I tried to parcel out the work, and with deadlines, that's sort of how you do it. But I didn't know how bad fiscal policy actually was, because the prior administration, George H.W. Bush's administration, had hidden from us and from the public, obviously, a lot of data that we had to track down. Fiscal policy. What do I mean? The basic idea, in recessionary periods with high unemployment, that is too little demand to absorb capacity, you need expansive fiscal policy. That is, you need to increase spending and lower taxes. That's the idea of fiscal policy as a balance wheel. And similarly, when inflation looms, that's too much demand for capacity, you need a constrictive fiscal policy. You've got to cut spending and increase taxes. At least that's what the theory would tell us. By the way, who sets fiscal policy? Is it A, the Federal Reserve, B, the Congressional Budget Office, C, Congress and the President, or D, the Office of Management and the Budget? Let's see if we can do this. Go. You can make a decision. You can just decide in your head. You can use this as a guide. Well, who sets fiscal policy? Well, basically, it is Congress and the President, because Congress and the President decide on spending, and fiscal policy is about spending, government spending. This man, John Maynard Keynes, really developed the whole theory, in effect, of fiscal policy, and it was during a time of recession. John Maynard Keynes, not an American, he was from England, and he understood something, that when there was inadequate demand, as there was during the Great Depression, then government had to step in to be the buyer of last resort in order to just get people back to work, in order to put money in people's pockets so they could turn around and buy stuff. Now, this sounds obvious, but it was not obvious at the time. And John Maynard Keynes, so the story goes, met with Franklin D. Roosevelt in Washington in the Oval Office, and it was a very cordial meeting. But Keynes sort of, I never heard him, but he kind of mumbled, apparently. And if you're English, I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but if you're English and you mumble, well, you just supplied, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, was trying to listen and trying to understand, but Keynes didn't really make a lot of sense to FDR, and FDR was, again, very polite, but at the end of the meeting, Keynes left, and he said, well, I'm not sure the president understood anything I said. And FDR said to his aide, I didn't understand anything he said. So Keynes did not necessarily influence Franklin D. Roosevelt or even his economic advisors. What really got us out of the Great Depression was World War II, because World War II demanded spending by the government on such a huge scale that everybody, almost everybody who could work, was put to work. And that meant that they got money. There was money in their pockets. Government went deep into debt, but it didn't matter. John Maynard Keynes said, you know, it's more important to get the economy going and getting money into people's pockets than worrying about debt. Which of these is the most true of expansive? That's what we're now talking about. Expansive fiscal policy. A, it increases the public debt and risks inflation. A, that's A. B, it reduces demand, which prevents inflation. Or C, it crowds out public-private investment. Or D, it stimulates demand, which creates jobs and boosts wages. We ought to think about this a little bit, because this is a hotly debated, it was, still is to some extent, a contested issue. The dominant view is D. It stimulates demand, which creates jobs, and it boosts wages. And for the reasons that I already mentioned about who is first to be fired and who is really burdened by recessions and depressions, almost of everybody, you can see why it's relevant to what we are talking about in this course. The absolute level of government debt. And by the way, I know you are constantly worried about debt. You are worried about government's debt, aren't you? I mean, of all the things going on with pandemics in Ukraine and everything else, the government debt is something that you spent a lot of time worrying about. My father, by the way, was a diehard Republican. Didn't think much of Roosevelt. And when I was a little tyke, I mean, even littler than I am now, my father said, Bobby, he called me Bobby. I was about 7, I think, 6 or 7. He said, Bobby, you and your children and your children's children will be paying down the debt created by Franklin D. Roosevelt. Well, I didn't know what a debt was, but I had nightmares. I thought about this huge, awful thing called the debt that I and my children and my children's children and everybody would be paying it down, and Franklin D. Roosevelt created this. And, well, it turned out my father, who was right about many things, was wrong about this. Because the debt that Franklin D. Roosevelt created was paid down very fast, because the economy grew so fast at the end of the Second World War. The absolute level of government debt is less significant than the ratio of the debt to the economy overall. So here we have World War II. This is Franklin D. Roosevelt's debt, and this is when my father told me that I and my children, my children's children, by the way, my granddaughter has not once mentioned FDR's debt. She's not worried about it. My 2 boys, never. When they were growing up, they never worried about it. Because you see, what happened is that ratio of debt to GDP to the economy kept on dropping. Why did it drop? Not because the debt went down, but because the ratio, the economy kept on growing so fast. And now we're back up to around here. Should we worry? Well, maybe we should if the ratio looks like it's getting worse and worse. But even a high debt GDP ratio needs to be understood in dynamic terms. This would be the argument. Is the ratio growing or declining? Well, it is now growing. Well, that's a worry. I don't mean you should stay up at night. I mean, there are a lot of other things to worry about, but that's at least something that you might want to consider. Will reducing the debt now cause an austerity trap? Now, this is important to understand. If, for example, we as the United States decided we were going to raise taxes and cut spending and slow the economy down by raising taxes and cutting spending right now, not really much political interest in doing that, but this is what some people are saying we should do. If we did that, maybe the economy would stop growing and maybe the ratio of the debt to the GDP would worsen. Do you understand what I'm getting at? We have to look at the denominator as well as the numerator. What's most likely to happen if the government debt gets very high? Well, is it A, the dollar ceases to be the world's dominant reserve currency? Or B, domestic prices begin to rising in anticipation of the value of the dollar dropping? That's inflation. Or C, private investment is crowded out? Or D, nothing. We shouldn't worry about the federal debt. So what's most likely to happen if the government debt gets very high? What do you think? Go. Okay, let's stop there and let's see what you think. Most of you, that is 61% of you, think it's B, and that is the dominant view of macroeconomists. That is, the big problem is inflation, or it would be even more inflation than we have right now. And there's some economists who say one of the reasons we have so much inflation right now is there has been so much spending, particularly spending related to COVID. Now, here's another point, and this is very relevant for our class. Not all government spending is the same. There is spending on past obligations, like Social Security, things that government is obligated to. I mentioned this last week. Government has got to honor its past obligations. There's also spending on current needs, individuals and families in need. There is a third category, spending on stabilizers. Stabilizers, by stabilizers I mean things like unemployment insurance that help when the economy is going into recession, helps prevent the economy from going too deep into recession, that is really not only helping individuals, but helping put money in the pockets of a lot of people so people can continue to spend and keep the economy going. A stabilizer, it's called, automatic stabilizer, if it's an income support during recessions. And then there's spending on future productivity that are really public investments like education and infrastructure and basic research and development. If you didn't do this spending, it would harm the denominator that I was talking about before, that is economic growth. So you can't just assume that all spending is the same. It's not. Government spending on automatic stabilizers, you can see, is exactly related to recessions. This is the COVID-19 pandemic. Oh, by the way, the last time the government had a surplus, an actual surplus in terms of a budget surplus, was 2001. I can't tell you the number of times I sat in both the Oval Office, the Roosevelt Room, the Cabinet Room, with the President, the Vice President, or with other cabinet members in the 90s, and everybody was worried about the budget deficit. Budget deficit, budget better, that's all anybody talked about. Because you see, that's all that the media were focusing on. And the opposition party, that is the Republican Party, that's how they were attacking the president. That you can't spend too much because the budget deficit will get out of control. I kept on saying, why are we worried about the budget deficit? It's more important to make investments in education and job training. More important to help people in need. Much more important to make investments in infrastructure. Don't worry about the budget deficit. Do you know how many times I said that? Maybe 3,000 times. Do you know how many times I was listened to? 0. The American Rescue Plan enacted in March 2021 $1.9 trillion relief package. It extended and raised federal unemployment benefits, $300 per week, ending in September. Go. Let's see where you are. Okay, well. So about 30% of you wish you were on vacation. That's going to happen. It really will happen. But most of you are fine. A few of you say easy peasy, but most of you see my challenge. Really, in this part of the course, with regard to taxes, macroeconomic policy, other things we're going to get into, is I want to challenge you, but I don't want to challenge you too much. I don't want you to tune out. But I also don't want to challenge you too little. Okay, monetary policy. Now, we've already talked about fiscal policy. One way of envisioning this is that there are two pedals. There are two gas pedals, and there are two brake pedals. One of the gas pedals is fiscal policy. Another is monetary policy. One of the brakes is fiscal policy. The other brake is monetary policy. In other words, fiscal and monetary policy can either be accelerators or brakes, and there are two of them. When demand is less than capacity, the Federal Reserve reduces interest rates to stimulate more demand. When inflation looms, the Fed increases interest rates to slow demand. This is the most important building in Washington. This is not the Capitol building. It's not Congress. It is the Federal Reserve. It's on Constitution Avenue. It's the Mariner Eccles building. Mariner Eccles was the chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1934 to 1948. I believe those are the dates, for a very long time. Mariner Eccles is a fascinating person. I wrote a part of a book about him. Nobody read it. But I did meet his granddaughter. He, in 1929, he went to Washington and testified. Now, nobody knew what was going on. Suddenly, the bottom dropped out of the economy. And the stock market went, it just went to hell. And the entire economy was tumbling into a territory nobody understood. Nobody knew why. Mariner Eccles went to Washington. He was a Westerner, a Western businessman. He was a Mormon. He didn't really know Washington. And he testified before Congress, and he said, well, what we really do need is major spending, and we need major public works, major infrastructure spending. We need spending on something that we might term sort of social insurance for people. In other words, Mariner Eccles in 1929 went to Washington and he gave Congress a blueprint for the entire New Deal. This is before Franklin D. Roosevelt even became president. He was a remarkable man. And the building is named after him. And why is it the most important building in Washington? Well, next week, the Federal Reserve's Open Market Committee is going to meet next Wednesday and Thursday. And everybody in American business, everybody on Wall Street, everybody who pays attention to the economy is going to wait with bated breath to hear what the Federal Reserve's Open Market Committee decides. There are 12 members, 7 members of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, President of the New York Fed, 4 of the remaining 11 Federal Reserve Bank presidents. They're Federal Reserve banks all over the United States. They're kind of regional banks. And will it decide when, whether, and by how much to raise interest rates? Now, this is really critical. Because if the Fed raises interest rates, What does it do? It slows the economy. This is presumably in response to inflation. The question is, how much does it slow the economy? Does it push the economy into recession? If it overdoes it, millions of people are going to lose their jobs. Even raising interest rates a little bit will probably cause a lot of people to what? What happens when interest rates are increased? Well, it means your bank loans are more expensive. It's more expensive for anybody to get a loan. Interest rates are higher, it's harder to get a loan. It means that if you have a variable rate interest rate on your mortgage, you have to pay more for your mortgage. That's going to be really hard for a lot of people. If you have an automobile loan, or if you want to get an auto loan, it's going to be harder for you to get it and pay for it and afford it. And the people who are going to be paying more are a lot of the people we've been discussing in this course. Now, they're being hurt by inflation too. In fact, arguably, they're being hurt more than anybody else by inflation. Because their dollars, remember, inflation is pretty regressive in terms of what we were talking about last week. This man is Horatio Alger, A, B, Alan Greenspan, C, Ben Bernanke, D, Paul Volcker, E, Al Dunlop. What do you say? Go. And the reason I want you to know these people is because these are very powerful players in wealth and poverty in America. So let's stop the bidding and let's see what you think, who you think he is. I don't think you know. Because he's definitely not Horatio Alger. Alan Greenspan, most of you think he is. No, he's not. Ben Bernanke, no, he's not. He's not Al Dunlop. He is Paul Volcker. Now, Paul Volcker was head of the Fed the last time this nation had double-digit inflation. This was in the late 1970s. And Paul Volcker decided that he and the Fed, as chairman of the Fed, he has a lot of influence. The chair of the Fed, the chair of the Open Market Committee, has huge influence. He was going to raise interest rates to the point where he broke the back of inflation. That's what he said. Those were his words. I'm going to break the back of inflation. Well, he did. He raised interest rates so high that he not only broke the back of inflation, but he broke the economy. He brought the economy into a recession, a deep recession. And he did something else, because presidents are blamed for the economy, even though presidents don't have a great deal of influence over the economy. Chairmen of the Federal Reserve Board have much more influence over the economy than presidents. But because of what Paul Volcker did, he ended Jimmy Carter's presidency, arguably. Paul Volcker, as you can see, he smoked cigars. What you can't see is that he was about 6'8". I had a couple of times that I met him at receptions, Washington receptions. By the way, I hate receptions. I hate receptions. And when you're a cabinet secretary or you're another official in Washington, you just have to go to all sorts of receptions. And I would go to receptions, and Paul Volcker was there, and I would try to talk with him. And literally, I would talk like this. I wouldn't hear a word he said. He wouldn't hear anything I said. But that's what he did. He broke the back of double-digit inflation, ended Jimmy Carter's presidency. See, what you can see here is the effective federal funds rate. That is what member banks of the Federal Reserve System charge each other for overnight loans. This is how they control interest rates. And look at what he did. Interest rates went through the roof, and the economy plunged deep into recession. A lot of people lost their jobs. Then we find the Fed running a big experiment. This man is A, Horatio Alger, B, Alan Greenspan, B, Ben Bernanke, C, Gerald D, Gerald Ford, Al, go. Okay, let's end the bidding into here and see what you think. Okay, most of you think that he is Alan Greenspan. That's 46. You're right. This is Alan Greenspan. Now, why do I want you to know who these people are? Again, I want to stress this. One of the problems in our democracy is that people often don't know where power lies. And one of the subtexts and sub-themes in this course is you need to know about power. You need to know the underlying realities of how the system actually works. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, or chairwomen of the Federal Reserve, have extraordinary power. This man, Alan Greenspan, was chairman of the Federal Reserve when I was in the cabinet, and he used to send signals. It's sort of inappropriate for the Fed chair to talk directly to a president. So he would send signals, and those signals to Bill Clinton were, if you don't bring down the budget deficit, I'm going to hike interest rates. And if I hike interest rates, you're not going to be reelected president in 1996. So I would go over and talk with Alan Greenspan. Just to get to know him, I practically invited myself to breakfast. You know, the Federal Reserve has its own dining room. It has its own budget. I mean, the Federal Reserve doesn't depend on Congress for an appropriation because the Federal Reserve makes money. It literally makes money. It decides how much money there is going to be. So the Federal Reserve, in effect, pays itself. And I thought, well, why not have breakfast? So I called his office and said, you know, I'd love to have breakfast. And he invited me over to breakfast. Almost nobody gets in the Federal Reserve to have breakfast. I did. And I can tell you, it's very luxurious. I mean, you walk in and, well, believe me, you want to have breakfast at the Federal Reserve if you possibly can. And Alan Greenspan, I mean, you know, the heavy cutlery and these kind of linen napkins, those heavy linen napkins, and just, I mean, and the best orange juice I have ever had in my life. I mean, it was not just freshly squeezed, it was squeezed almost in front of me. And Alan Greenspan, a very nice gentleman, a follower of Ayn Rand. We didn't see eye to eye politically, necessarily, but we had a very, very good discussion. Alan Greenspan was particularly powerful as a chair. The chair meets with the Open Market Committee, but the chair has so much power because the chair gets information from all sorts of sources about the economy, which the other members of the Open Market Committee don't have. The chairman has data. Whenever you are in a position where you have to share power, if you have more data than anybody else, you have the power. How did Alan Greenspan get all that power? How did Alan Greenspan know so much about the economy? He knew things about the economy that nobody else did. Well, I began to understand. You see, long about the time I met with Alan Greenspan, Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton were locked in a fight over the budget, leading to a closure of the government. Now, just before the government closed, and that was miserable, I mean a closure of the government because there's no money officially to pay employees means that I, as labor secretary, and everybody else who was a secretary of any department had to tell their employees to go home, and we don't know when you're coming back, and we don't know if you're going to ever be paid. You're certainly not going to be paid for the days you lose. I mean, it was miserable. But I got a note from Alan Greenspan, and he said, whatever you do, don't send Cindy home. I said to one of my assistants, who is Cindy? And nobody knew who Cindy was. And I thought, why, who is Cindy? And why do you care about Cindy? Well, I did some investigating. It turns out that Cindy was the first person in the department, in the Bureau of Labor Statistics, to get the data on unemployment for the month before. And Cindy, this is very carefully guarded information, because if you knew what the unemployment rate was going to be before it was announced, you could make bets, you could actually do very well in the stock market. So it has to be very, very carefully guarded. Cindy had been at the department for 30 years. Cindy knew what the unemployment rate was going to be before it was announced, and she would tell Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan had moles all over the federal government. I'm telling you things that I probably shouldn't tell you. But this is how government works. And he was doing nothing illegal. He developed these sources of information. All of them enhanced his power. And Alan Greenspan actually did something that I found to be remarkably important. He did an experiment that revealed a great deal. As demand picked up in the mid-1990s, the Fed, under Alan Greenspan, barely raised rates. Now, I want to make sure you understand what I just said. Normally, as demand picks up from a recession, as we go into an expansion, normally the rule had been that the Fed will raise rates if unemployment gets below a certain level. In fact, economists used to call it the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment. How much unemployment can be borne without inflation accelerating? Alan Greenspan did an experiment, because Alan Greenspan was data-driven. He was not a theorist. What he told me over lunch, over breakfast, and what I was actually very interested in was that the economy was less prone to inflation than it used to be because workers had very little power. Union membership, as we've talked about in this course, had shrunk dramatically. So workers could not dictate their wages. There used to be something called wage price inflation. But Alan Greenspan knew that was no longer the case. He also knew something else, and that was that in this modern global economy, if there is more and more demand on companies for production, those companies can get goods, components, and supplies from abroad. They are not constrained by their capacity in the United States. Put those both together, said Alan Greenspan, and the old assumption about the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment made no sense. You could run the economy without inflation at a lower rate of unemployment. Now, to me, that made a great deal of sense, what Alan Greenspan was saying. It also meant that a lot of people who were in the bottom 20%, 30%, 40% of the income spectrum, they would not lose their jobs. They would not be drafted into the fight against inflation, which had been the case before. This was an important experiment. It contributed to a huge increase in jobs in the 1990s, so it really wasn't my doing, although I claimed it with you. And what we see here is the unemployment rate dropping dramatically in the 1990s as the economy grew. That means that a lot of people in the bottom 20, 30, 40% had jobs. Not only did they have jobs, but median incomes started to grow as well because the demand for workers picked up. This was one of the first times in a 40-year period where the median income actually grew. because essentially unemployment got down to below 3%. When unemployment gets down to below 3%, employers really need people, and what are they willing to do? They're willing to train people. They will send vans out to neighborhoods that never are hear from employers in order to try to get people to come to work. They will do everything they can to get workers. That 3% unemployment rate seems to be almost the magical rate at which you begin to raise incomes, particularly people who are among the most vulnerable in society. And I'm not going to go through this with you. I will tell you, his name is not Antonin Scalia or Robert Rubin. It is not Lawrence Summers. He's Ben Bernanke. And Ben Bernanke was at the Fed when we had the explosion of 2008, the financial meltdown. What did Ben Bernanke do? Why do I even present him to you as a very important figure in wealth and poverty? Because he kept interest rates extraordinarily low. After the crisis of 2008, Ben Bernanke's Fed cut interest rates to 0. This was another experiment. Ben Bernanke said, look, we can't afford to have this many people out of work, and we're going to just take a chance. We're going to go to 0, and we're also going to do something else. I'm going to buy up a lot of bonds. We're going to start buying corporate bonds. It was called quantitative easing. We're going to actually expand the money supply. Now, I don't want to get into the weeds here with you, but I want you to just understand the concept. What Bernanke was doing was radically pushing on the accelerator of monetary policy. Not fiscal policy, we're talking about monetary policy. I also want to make sure you understand how significant this all is for the subject of this course. We're talking about people's lives. They don't understand. Most people are not paying attention to the interest rates. They don't know what's happening in the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee. They will not know what's happening next Wednesday or Thursday. But what it does is going to affect millions of people's lives. Which of these is the most true of expansive monetary policy? That is, prolonged near 0 interest rates. A, does it encourage inflation? B, does it bolster the stock market and enrich the already rich? C, it stimulates demand, which creates jobs, especially for the bottom half. D, it may mean the Fed runs out of ammunition for the next downturn. Well, we've already gone through this. I'm not going to ask you to do this, but it is C. But A and B and D are also possibly collateral effects. The current chair of the Fed is Jerome Powell. Janet Yellen was the Fed chair before Jerome Powell. Janet Yellen was a faculty member here at Berkeley. You know that. And she is now Secretary of the Treasury. Jerome Powell. Rates have been near 0. I mean, we went through a terrible pandemic recession. But remember what I said. Now, demand is exceeding supply. We are now in the inflationary end of that pandemic recession. The question is, do we have to raise interest rates? Or will supply automatically catch up with demand? Do we have to slow the economy? Or will the economy automatically quicken? Now, that's partly an empirical question, but it is also a value-laden question. How worried are you about slowing the economy and causing a real risk of a recession? especially now with the war in Ukraine. Macroeconomics is not science. There are too many variables. You've got to make educated guesses. Again, here you can see how low interest rates have been, federal funds rate. What happens now? We'll find out. The official rate of unemployment. Well, you can see what happened to unemployment, but now employment is coming back. Should the Fed now raise rates? Yes, inflation is getting out of control. Or B, no, unemployment is still too high and workers still haven't got much of a raise. Well, what do you think? Okay, let's see what you think. Well, there's not overwhelming. About 58% of you say no, unemployment is still too high. But about 41% of you say yes, inflation is getting out of control. Again, as I want to emphasize with you, there is no absolute right answer. This is a matter of weighing and balancing imperfect information, but values also play a role here. And let's make sure we understand. The main reason inflation is surging now, is it because oil and gas prices are rising as a result of the war in Ukraine? Or because B, the pandemic has generated large pent-up demand for goods? Or C, the end of the pandemic has created supply bottlenecks around the world? Or D, monopolistic corporations are finding it easy to raise prices? I'm not going to even ask you to do this because to some extent it's all of the above. The real interesting question is, what percentage? What are the weights you would give to each? I would give maybe a small bit to A because that's really just started. B, I would say yes, that's really big, but that's temporary. Because as people spend and get the goods they need and shift back to services, where most people have been spending most of their money, most of their lives, the demand is going to get back to normal. And what about C? The end of the pandemic has created supply bottlenecks around the world. Yes, absolutely. But those supply bottlenecks are eventually going to be overcome as more and more supply is added to the world. And D, monopolistic corporations are finding it easy to raise prices. Yes, I think that's a bigger issue than a lot of people are paying attention to, because normally, you see, if corporations were in normal competition, and we've talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago, if companies were in competition with each other, you would expect that they would do everything possible to avoid losing customers to their competitors. Which means that as they paid more for their supplies and components, they would, if they possibly could, absorb those costs rather than passing them on to their customers in the form of higher prices. But they're not doing this. And one reason they're not doing it is they're not really facing very intense competition. There's a lot of monopoly out there. The problem is you can't really deal with this as an inflation-fighting measure because you need antitrust laws, and those take a long time. Those are very difficult to implement. So here's a gun. I'm not going to ask you to do this, but who is most likely to be drafted into the fight against inflation? Well, it is C, the poorest 10%. Actually, the poorest half, who are more likely to lose their jobs. So, overview. The dominant view is expansive fiscal and monetary policies increase aggregate demand toward the economy's productive capacity, which causes employers to hire more people, including low-skilled people in the bottom half of the income distribution, forcing employers to recruit and retrain them, and then retain them, and therefore pay them higher wages. Tight labor markets also have an effect on reducing racial inequality. The racial gap in unemployment begins to close when you have a tight labor market. The racial wage gap begins to close with a tight labor market. So that means expansionary fiscal and monetary policy leading to tight labor markets helps reduce income inequality. But it also risks inflation. And inflation may force the Fed to raise interest rates, slow the economy, and hurt lower income people. So on which side should policymakers err? It is not clear which is best. It depends on, to some extent, your reading of the data and also your own values, which gets me to the big switcheroo. Wealthy Americans used to finance the government primarily through their tax payments. We saw this last week. We saw that in the 1950s, for example, the highest marginal tax rate was, under Dwight Eisenhower, was over 90%, and the effective highest tax rate, even after all the tax credits and deductions, was probably close to 50%, pretty high. And we also saw what's happened. Here we are today. So wealthy Americans are no longer financing the federal government through their taxes. How are they financing the federal government? They're financing the federal government by lending the federal government money. They are investing in government bonds. Not only wealthy Americans, but wealthy Americans by and large are the ones who have enough money to actually buy bonds. And so you see here who owns the United States national debt. Well, you've got foreign investors, about 30%, but you've got more than foreign investors, you've got United States investors who own the national debt, who buy bonds. The United States government pays about $1.5 billion in interest payments every day on those bonds. And this is, the federal debt. That's what we were talking about a little while ago. This is just the other side of the federal. These are the people who collect money on the debt, which means as the top marginal tax rate drops and the deficit grows, more tax revenue goes to paying interest on the national debt, mostly to the wealthy who got the benefit of the tax cut. I call this the big switcheroo. This is looking on the inside of the beast to see what's really going on. Also, another thing to take note of, and this is important, when the Fed keeps interest rates low, total savings shift into the stock market. So people who have a lot of savings, particularly wealthy people who are the only ones who have a lot of savings, what do? Well, as interest rates go down, they're not going to go put their money into bonds because they're not very much, they can't get very much out of the bonds. They're going to go into the stock market, which is going to push up share prices. And remember, what we've already seen is that the richest 1% own half of all the value of U.S. stocks in terms of American ownership, and the richest 10% own over 80% of the stock market. These are all pieces of the puzzle. These are all pieces of the puzzle that we started to ask ourselves in the first session of the class, which is why do we have stagnant wages, and why have so much of the increase in the economy's gains gone to the top? This is a piece of an answer to the puzzle. As more economic gains go to the top 1%, will there be enough total demand in the economy to reduce unemployment and raise the wages of most people? Now, by asking this question, I'm leaving this question with you because it's a very subtle but important question. It's the question that Mariner Eccles raised in the 1930s. In fact, he was obsessed by this. And the question is, if you have more and more inequality, so people at the top are getting more and more of the benefits of growth, more and more of income and wealth is concentrating at the top, who is going to have enough money to buy everything that the economy is capable of producing? At some point, you run out of buyers. At some point, you've got to either redistribute or you've got to have what? Some sort of a universal minimum income? As we examined a few weeks ago, technology itself is advancing at a very rapid rate, doing more and more. It doesn't mean that unemployment is going to be going up, because there's always going to be things that people want other people to do and would pay for. What it means is that wages for most people may not go up, they may go down. And if wages don't go up, and if technology is making more and more jobs pay less, who's going to buy the technology? Who's going to buy the gadgets? Henry Ford understood this problem in the early part of the 20th century when Ford Motor was building all of these Model T Fords, and Henry Ford raised the wages of people on his assembly line. Why did he raise them? He raised them, he said, because he wants more people to buy Model T Fords. Now, people kind of scratch their heads. That didn't make a lot of sense, because people on the assembly line are not going to turn around and buy Model T Fords. A few of them will, but no, Henry Ford had something different in mind. He said to himself, and he wrote down in his diary, that if more and more employers followed his example by raising wages, that would mean people would have more disposable income, and that would help the economy overall. The issues we're talking about today seem abstract. They are very real. They are not new, but they take very new dimensions. When next week the Fed meets and decides to raise interest rates, which I am almost certain they will do, watch to see how that is described, analyzed, and covered by the press. Watch to see how much of the information the public gets is similar to the information and context and framing you have got today. Because in a democracy, if people don't know what's happening, they cannot participate. Have a great weekend.